The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic one final time. The heavy bearskin hat sat perfectly on his head, and his polished boots reflected the early light like mirrors. At 28 years old, James had spent 5 years as one of the Queen's Guard, but today felt different somehow. The weight of tradition pressed down on his shoulders as tourists began gathering behind the iron railings, cameras ready to capture the famous changing of the guard ceremony. James had always taken pride in his ability to remain perfectly still during his duties. The training had been rigorous, teaching him to ignore distractions, weather, and even physical discomfort. Tourists would often try to make the guards laugh or react, waving silly objects or making funny faces. Children would point and giggle, while adults snapped endless photos. Through it all, James maintained his stoic expression, his eyes fixed straight ahead, embodying the discipline and honor of the British military. The morning crowd was typical for a Tuesday in late autumn. Families with young children pressed against the barriers. Elderly couples shared stories about previous visits to London, and tour groups clustered around their guides who explained the history and significance of the ceremonial guard. James could hear fragments of conversations in different languages as visitors from around the world gathered to witness this quintessentially British tradition. Among the crowd stood an elderly woman, perhaps in her 70s, wearing a simple navy coat and clutching a worn leather handbag. Her silver hair was neatly arranged under a small hat, and her weathered hands gripped the iron railing as she watched the guards with an intensity that set her apart from the casual observers around her. While others chatted and pointed, she stood in complete silence, her pale blue eyes never leaving the uniformed figures. Margaret Thompson had traveled from a small village in Yorkshire, specifically to see the changing of the guard. It wasn't tourism that brought her to London, but something much deeper and more personal. Hidden carefully in her handbag was a photograph she had carried for over 50 years, its edges worn soft from countless gentle touches. The image showed a young man in military uniform, his smile bright and full of hope, unaware of the fate that awaited him in a distant land. As the ceremony began, James took his position at the palace gates. The familiar rhythm of military precision unfolded around him. Commands were shouted, boots marched in perfect synchronization, and the band played traditional tunes that had echoed through these streets for generations. The tourists fell silent, mesmerized by the pageantry and discipline on display. But something was different about the elderly woman's presence. While others watched with casual interest or excitement, she observed with the reverence of someone who understood the true meaning behind the uniforms and ceremony. Her eyes held a depth of knowledge about sacrifice and service that comes only from personal loss. She had lived through wars, rationing, and the long, anxious nights of waiting for news from the front lines. The morning progressed with military efficiency. James remained motionless at his post, his rifle held at the precise angle taught in countless training sessions. His breathing was controlled, his posture perfect, and his mind focused on maintaining the standards expected of the Queen's Guard. Years of practice had made these requirements second nature, allowing him to perform his duties while remaining alert to his surroundings. Margaret watched every detail of the ceremony with growing emotion. The precision of the movements, the pristine condition of the uniforms, and the obvious pride the guards took in their service reminded her of another young soldier from decades past. Her grandson, Michael, had possessed the same dedication and honor before he was deployed to Afghanistan 3 years earlier. The similarity was both comforting and heartbreaking. As tourists began to disperse after the main ceremony, Margaret remained at the railing. She had waited months for this moment, saving money from her pension to make the journey to London. Her arthritic fingers fumbled with the clasp of her handbag as she retrieved the precious photograph. The image had been taken just days before Michael's deployment. Capturing him in his dress uniform with the same pride and determination she now saw reflected in the guard before her. The autumn air grew colder, but neither James nor Margaret seemed to notice. He continued his duty with unwavering focus while she gathered the courage to do something she had planned for months, but wasn't sure she could accomplish. The weight of grief and pride battled within her chest as she looked from the photograph to the young guard standing just meters away. Other tourists had moved on to different attractions, leaving the area quieter than before. A few dedicated photographers remained, hoping to capture the perfect shot of the stoic guards. but the earlier crowds had thinned considerably. This created an atmosphere of greater intimacy between the remaining observers and the ceremonial soldiers. James noticed the elderly woman was still there, still watching with that same intense focus. Through his peripheral vision, he could see she was holding something in her hands, though military protocol prevented him from turning his head to look directly. His training had taught him to be aware of everything around him while maintaining his rigid position, a skill that now made him acutely conscious of the woman's continued presence. Margaret's heart raced as she realized this might be her only opportunity. She had rehearsed what she wanted to do countless times during the train journey from Yorkshire, but now that the moment had arrived, her courage wavered. The photograph felt heavy in her trembling hands as she took a tentative step closer to the guardrail that separated her from the young soldier who reminded her so much of her beloved grandson. The photograph trembled slightly in Margaret's weathered hands as she took another step closer to where James stood. The black and white image had been her most treasured possession since receiving it from Michael just before his final deployment. In the picture, her grandson stood tall and proud in his military dress uniform, his young face beaming with the confidence and optimism that had defined his character since childhood. Michael Thompson had been 22 when the photo was taken. Just 6 years younger than the guard who now stood before his grandmother, he had enlisted straight from university, driven by a sense of duty and adventure that Margaret had both admired and feared. The family had gathered for a farewell dinner the night before he left for Afghanistan, and Michael had insisted on having his photo taken in his formal uniform as a keepsake for his grandmother. James could sense the woman's approach through his carefully trained peripheral awareness. His military training had taught him to maintain absolute stillness regardless of distractions, but something about her deliberate, respectful movement was different from the usual tourist behavior. She wasn't trying to provoke a reaction or capture a silly photograph. Instead, her approach carried a solemnity that spoke of deeper purpose. The autumn wind picked up, rustling the fallen leaves around the palace grounds and causing Margaret's coat to flutter slightly. She clutched her handbag more tightly with one hand, while the other carefully protected the precious photograph from the breeze. Her steps were measured and purposeful, each one bringing her closer to a moment she had dreamed about and dreaded in equal measure. Margaret remembered the day the photograph was taken with crystal clarity. Michael had looked so handsome in his uniform, his shoulders broad and his smile infectious. The whole family had been proud but worried, knowing that his deployment would take him far from their quiet Yorkshire village to one of the world's most dangerous regions. She had kissed his cheek after the photo was snapped, whispering a prayer for his safe return that would go unanswered. The morning sun continued its arc across the London sky, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across the palace courtyard. James had been on duty for nearly 2 hours, his body maintaining the rigid posture required of the Queen's Guard despite the physical strain. His red tunic remained perfectly pressed, his bearskin hat sat at the exact regulation angle, and his rifle was held with unwavering precision. Other tourists occasionally paused to take photos or observe the guard, but their attention was fleeting. Margaret's sustained focus was unusual and, James had to admit to himself, somewhat unsettling. Not because she posed any threat, but because her presence carried an emotional weight that seemed to penetrate even his professional stoicism. There was something in her patient watching that suggested she understood the true meaning behind the ceremony and uniform. As Margaret drew closer, she could see more details of the young guard's face. His jawline was strong and determined, his eyes focused straight ahead with the discipline that military service demands. The similarity to Michael was striking, not just in physical appearance but in the bearing and pride evident in every line of his posture. It was as if she were looking at her grandson as he might have appeared in this prestigious role. The photograph in her hands had been taken during what turned out to be Michael's last leave home. He had spent 2 weeks with the family, helping his grandfather with autumn repairs around the house and spending long evenings talking with Margaret about his experiences in training and his hopes for the future. He had spoken with excitement about serving his country and protecting the freedoms they all cherished. James noticed that the elderly woman had stopped just a few feet away from the barrier that separated the guards from the public. She was no longer moving, but her presence had become even more intense. Through his peripheral vision, he could see she was holding something small in her hands, cradling it with the care one might show a precious artifact or religious relic. Margaret's heart pounded as she stood so close to the guard. She had traveled hundreds of miles for this moment, driven by a need she couldn't fully explain even to herself. Perhaps it was the desire to honor Michael's memory by sharing it with someone who embodied the same values of service and sacrifice. Maybe it was the hope that this young soldier might understand the pride and pain that came with loving someone in uniform. The other remaining tourists seemed to fade into the background as Margaret focused entirely on the guard before her. She was acutely aware that approaching him would be breaking protocol, but she also knew that some moments transcend rules and regulations. This felt like one of those moments, a convergence of past and present that demanded acknowledgement. Michael's letters from Afghanistan had been full of descriptions of his fellow soldiers and their shared commitment to their mission. He had written about the bonds formed between men and women in uniform, the way they looked out for each other regardless of rank or background. Margaret had saved every letter, reading them repeatedly until she could recite passages from memory. The wind died down, creating a moment of perfect stillness in the courtyard. James remained motionless at his post, but every fiber of his being was aware of the elderly woman's presence. Years of training had prepared him for many situations, but nothing had quite prepared him for the emotional intensity radiating from this gentle stranger, who continued to watch him with such profound attention. Margaret took a deep breath, gathering courage from memories of Michael's bravery and her own determination to honor his sacrifice. The photograph felt warm in her hands despite the cool autumn air, as if it carried some essence of the young man it depicted. She knew that what she was about to do would change everything, both for herself and for the young guard who stood so proudly before her, unaware of the story about to unfold. Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper when she finally spoke, but in the relative quiet of the courtyard, her words carried clearly to where James stood. "Excuse me, young man," she said, her Yorkshire accent soft but distinct. "I know you can't respond, but I need to show you something if you'll allow me." James felt his heart skip slightly at the unexpected address. His training dictated that he maintain his position and ignore all attempts at interaction from the public. But something in the woman's tone made this feel different from the usual tourist provocations. Her voice carried none of the playful teasing he was accustomed to hearing. Instead, it held a gravity that suggested whatever she wanted to share was deeply important. The elderly woman took another small step forward, bringing her right up to the barrier that separated the public from the ceremonial guards. Her movements were careful and respectful, showing no intention of actually crossing the boundary that protocol demanded be maintained. She held the photograph against her chest with both hands, as if drawing strength from its presence. "My name is Margaret Thompson," she continued, her voice growing slightly stronger with each word. "I've come from Yorkshire today, and I've been waiting 3 months for the courage to make this journey." Her pale blue eyes never left James's face, even though his gaze remained fixed straight ahead as regulations required. James could hear every word clearly, and despite his training, he found himself genuinely curious about what had brought this woman so far from home. There was something in her manner that spoke of profound loss and equally profound love. He had encountered grieving relatives before, usually family members of soldiers who had served with distinction, and he recognized the particular quality of reverence in Margaret's voice. Margaret slowly raised the photograph, holding it where James could see it clearly through his peripheral vision, without having to move his eyes. The black and white image showed a young soldier in dress uniform, his smile bright and confident, his posture reflecting the same pride and discipline that James embodied in his current role as Queen's Guard. "This is my grandson, Michael Thompson," Margaret said, her voice beginning to waver with emotion. "He was a soldier just like you. He served in Afghanistan with the 2nd Battalion, Parachute Regiment. He would have been so proud to see what you do here, standing guard for our Queen and country." The words hit James like a physical blow, though his exterior remained perfectly composed. He could see enough of the photograph to recognize the military bearing of the young man pictured, and Margaret's use of the past tense told him everything he needed to know about how that story had ended. His own heart began to beat faster as he realized he was in the presence of a Gold Star grandmother, a family member who had lost someone in service to their country. Margaret's hands shook slightly as she continued to hold up the photograph, Michael was 22 when this picture was taken, just before his last deployment. He was so excited about serving, so proud of his uniform and his mission. He believed deeply in protecting the freedoms we all enjoy, and he was willing to give his life for that belief. The courtyard seemed to grow quieter around them, as if the very stones of Buckingham Palace were listening to Margaret's story. Other tourists had moved on to different parts of their London tours, leaving just a handful of people in the immediate area. Even they seemed to sense something significant was happening, and maintained a respectful distance. James found himself fighting an internal battle between his duty to remain motionless and his human desire to acknowledge this woman's loss. Every fiber of his being wanted to turn and look at her properly, to offer some gesture of respect and understanding. But his training held firm, keeping him locked in the rigid posture that symbolized the unwavering dedication of the British military. He wrote to me every week when he was deployed, Margaret continued, her voice growing more emotional with each sentence. He told me about his fellow soldiers, about how they looked out for each other, about the honor he felt in serving alongside such brave men and women. He said the uniform meant everything to him because it represented something bigger than himself. The photograph captured Michael at what must have been one of the happiest moments of his military career. His eyes sparkled with enthusiasm and determination, and his smile suggested someone who had found his true calling in life. The formal pose and pristine condition of his uniform indicated this was likely taken during a significant ceremony or before an important assignment. James could feel his professional composure beginning to crack slightly. He had joined the military himself partly out of a desire to serve and protect, and hearing about a fellow soldier who had made the ultimate sacrifice touched him deeply. The fact that this grieving grandmother had traveled so far just to share her grandson's story with him was both humbling and profoundly moving. Margaret wiped away a tear that had escaped, despite her efforts to maintain her composure. Michael never came home from that deployment, she said simply. He was killed by an improvised explosive device while on patrol. He died doing what he believed in, protecting his fellow soldiers and serving his country. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with grief and pride intermingled. James felt moisture gathering in his own eyes. Though he fought desperately to maintain the stoic expression required of his position, the weight of Margaret's loss was palpable, and her courage in sharing it with him was almost overwhelming. "I wanted you to see his face," Margaret whispered, holding the photograph a little higher. "I wanted someone in uniform, someone who understands what it means to serve, to know that Michael existed and that he mattered. I thought maybe if you could see him, you might understand why I'm so grateful for what you do here every day." James felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. This was no longer just about maintaining protocol or performing ceremonial duties. This had become about honoring the memory of a fallen soldier and acknowledging the sacrifice of the families left behind. The photograph in Margaret's hands represented not just one young man's service, but the countless others who had given everything for their country. The emotional weight of Margaret's words settled over James like a heavy blanket. Standing there in his perfectly pressed red tunic, maintaining the rigid posture that had been drilled into him through countless hours of training, he found himself fighting the most difficult battle of his military career. It wasn't against an enemy or harsh conditions, but against the overwhelming human urge to break protocol and properly honor this woman's devastating loss. Margaret continued to hold the photograph steady, her weathered fingers gripping its edges with tender care. The autumn sun caught the surface of the image, illuminating Michael's young face and making his bright smile seem almost alive. She had memorized every detail of this picture over the 3 years since his death, but showing it to someone who would truly understand its significance gave it new meaning. "He used to talk about the Queen's Guard when he was little," Margaret said, her voice growing softer as memories flooded back. "We'd watch the changing of the guard on television during special occasions, and Michael would stand at attention in our living room, mimicking what he saw. Even then he understood that wearing the uniform meant something important." James could feel his throat tightening as he listened to her words. The image of a young boy playing soldier in his grandmother's living room, dreaming of one day serving his country with such distinction, was almost too poignant to bear. How many children had similar dreams, and how many would pay the ultimate price for following them? The few remaining tourists in the area seemed to sense something profound was happening. They maintained their distance, some perhaps recognizing the sacred nature of what they were witnessing. A young couple with their children moved quietly away, instinctively understanding that this moment belonged to the elderly woman and the stoic guard. When Michael was deployed, Margaret continued, her voice beginning to crack with emotion. He sent me a letter every Sunday without fail. In one of them, he wrote about how proud he would be if he could ever earn the honor of standing guard at Buckingham Palace. He said it would be the perfect combination of ceremony and service, protecting something precious while representing the very best of British military tradition. The words struck James with unexpected force. Here was a young soldier who had dreamed of doing exactly what James was privileged to do every day, but whose life had been cut short before that dream could be realized. The randomness and unfairness of fate had never seemed more apparent or more cruel. Margaret's eyes filled with fresh tears as she looked at the photograph, then back at James. I know you can't respond to me, and I respect that completely, but I needed someone wearing our country's uniform to see Michael's face and know his story. You're standing where he dreamed of standing, serving in the way he hoped to serve. The elderly woman's voice broke completely on the last words, and she pressed the photograph against her heart, as if trying to draw strength from the memory of her grandson's love. The raw grief in her expression was matched by an equal measure of pride, creating a complex emotional landscape that James recognized from his own family's military history. James felt something warm roll down his cheek beneath the shadow of his bearskin hat. Despite every moment of training, every lecture about maintaining composure, every drill designed to build unshakable discipline, a single tear had escaped. The photograph of Michael Thompson, the story of his service and sacrifice, and the profound love of the grandmother who had traveled hundreds of miles to share his memory, had broken through defenses James hadn't even known he possessed. Margaret noticed the change immediately. Through her own tears, she saw the slight tremor in the guard's jaw, the barely perceptible shift in his breathing, and most importantly, the evidence of emotion on his face. For the first time since beginning her story, a small smile touched the corners of her mouth. This young soldier understood. Michael's memory had been received and honored by someone who truly comprehended its significance. Thank you, she whispered, so quietly that only James could hear her. Thank you for letting him matter to you. The gratitude in her voice was almost more than James could bear. Here was a woman who had lost the most precious thing in her world, and yet she was thanking him for simply acknowledging that loss. The humility and grace she displayed in the face of such devastating grief was a testament to the same strength and character that had produced a grandson willing to die for his country. James wanted desperately to speak, to tell Margaret how deeply her grandson's story had affected him, to express his admiration for Michael's service and sacrifice. He wanted to share his own understanding of what it meant to wear the uniform, to carry the weight of tradition and honor that came with military service. Most of all, he wanted to tell her that Michael's memory would stay with him long after this moment ended. But his voice remained locked behind the requirements of duty and protocol. The Queen's Guard did not speak during ceremonial duties, did not break from their rigid posture, did not allow personal emotions to interfere with their symbolic role. These rules had been established over centuries and were not meant to be broken, regardless of circumstances. Yet something profound was changing within James as he stood there, one tear still visible on his cheek. The mechanical precision of his training was being challenged by something more fundamental and human. The story of Michael Thompson had created a crack in the armor of military discipline, allowing genuine emotion to seep through. Margaret slowly lowered the photograph, though she continued to hold it carefully in both hands. She had accomplished what she came to do, sharing Michael's story with someone who could truly appreciate its significance. The young guard's tear told her that her grandson's memory had been received with the respect and understanding she had hoped for. I'll let you return to your duties now, Margaret said softly, taking a small step back from the barrier. But I want you to know that seeing you here, serving with such dedication and honor, helps me understand why Michael was so proud to be a soldier. Thank you for keeping faith with all of us who believe in what you represent. Margaret began to turn away, carefully placing the precious photograph back into her handbag, when something extraordinary happened. James, despite every regulation and protocol that governed his behavior as a member of the Queen's Guard, made a choice that would define not just this moment, but the rest of his military career. Very slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, James began to turn his head toward Margaret. The movement was gradual and controlled, but unmistakably deliberate. For the first time during his duty shift, he was breaking the fundamental rule that required him to maintain his forward gaze at all times. The risk was enormous, potentially career-ending, but something deeper than military discipline was driving his actions. Margaret froze when she realized what was happening. Her hand was halfway into her handbag, the photograph still visible, when she noticed the guard's slight movement. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched this young soldier make what she understood was a significant sacrifice of his own professional standing to acknowledge her and her grandson's memory. When James's eyes finally met Margaret's, the full weight of the moment crashed over both of them. Here was a direct human connection that transcended rank, protocol, and ceremony. In that gaze, Margaret saw not just a ceremonial guard, but a young man deeply moved by her story. James saw not just another tourist, but a grieving grandmother whose love had compelled her to travel across the country to honor her fallen grandson. The few seconds they looked at each other felt like hours. Without saying a word, James conveyed his respect for Michael's service, his recognition of Margaret's sacrifice, and his understanding of what it truly meant to wear the uniform. His eyes, still slightly moist from the earlier tear, spoke volumes about the impact her story had made on him. Margaret felt her heart swell with a mixture of gratitude and fresh grief. This simple gesture of acknowledgement from the young guard meant more to her than all the formal condolences and official letters she had received after Michael's death. Here was genuine recognition from someone who understood the true cost of service, someone who appreciated the weight of the uniform he wore. Very slowly, James raised his right hand from his rifle and brought it to his temple in a crisp, precise salute. The movement was executed with all the skill and precision of his military training, but it carried an emotional weight that transformed it from a mere formality into something sacred. This salute was not part of any official ceremony or required protocol. It was a personal tribute from one soldier to another, from the living to the dead, from a representative of the present military to the memory of a fallen comrade. Margaret's composure finally crumbled completely. Tears flowed freely down her cheeks as she watched this brave young man risk his career to honor her grandson. The salute was everything she had hoped for, and more than she had dared to expect. It was recognition, respect, and remembrance all embodied in a single, perfect military gesture. "Oh, Michael," she whispered, pressing her hand to her heart. "He sees you, darling. He knows you mattered." James held the salute for several long seconds, longer than any regulation would require, making sure Margaret understood its significance. This was not a hurried gesture or an accidental movement. It was a deliberate, meaningful tribute to Lance Corporal Michael Thompson, whose photograph would forever be etched in James's memory. When James finally lowered his hand and slowly returned his gaze to the front, both he and Margaret were forever changed. The barrier between them remained physically intact, but emotionally something profound had been shared. The ritual of military ceremony had been transcended by something more fundamental, the human recognition of sacrifice and service. Margaret wiped her eyes with a handkerchief she pulled from her coat pocket, her movements shaky with emotion. She looked at James one more time, mouthing the words "thank you" silently, knowing that he would understand. The young guard's breach of protocol had given her something she hadn't even known she was seeking, confirmation that Michael's memory lived on in the hearts of his fellow soldiers. Other tourists began to return to the area, unaware of the extraordinary moment that had just taken place. To them, James appeared exactly as he had when they had left, standing perfectly still in his red tunic and bearskin hat, rifle held at the precise regulation angle. They could not have imagined that this stoic figure had just participated in one of the most moving tributes to military service that either he or Margaret would ever experience. James's training reasserted itself, his posture returning to the exact standards required of the Queen's Guard. But internally, everything had changed. He was no longer just performing a ceremonial duty. He was carrying forward the memory and honor of every soldier who had served before him, including Lance Corporal Michael Thompson of Yorkshire. Margaret stood quietly for a few more minutes, watching the guard who had given her grandson such a beautiful tribute. She knew that Michael would have been so proud to know that his story had been received with such respect and understanding by a fellow soldier. The photograph in her handbag seemed to carry new weight, not just as a memorial to loss, but as a bridge between past and present service. The autumn sun continued its journey across the London sky, casting changing patterns of light and shadow across the palace grounds. But for James and Margaret, time had taken on a different quality during their encounter. In the space of just a few minutes, two strangers had shared something profound about sacrifice, service, and the bonds that connect all who wear their country's uniform. As Margaret finally prepared to leave, she knew that she would carry the memory of James's salute with her for the rest of her life. It would join the photograph as one of her most treasured possessions, proof that Michael's service and sacrifice continued to matter to those who understood its true meaning. The weeks that followed Margaret's visit to Buckingham Palace brought unexpected changes for both her and James. For Margaret, the journey back to Yorkshire felt different than her trip to London. The train carried her home with a sense of completion and peace that had been absent from her life since Michael's death 3 years earlier. The young guard's salute had given her something she hadn't realized she desperately needed: confirmation that her grandson's sacrifice continued to resonate with those who understood its true meaning. James found himself profoundly changed by the encounter as well. During subsequent guard duties, he carried with him not just the weight of ceremony and tradition, but the very real memory of Lance Corporal Michael Thompson. The photograph Margaret had shown him remained vivid in his mind, and he found new meaning in every aspect of his service. The red tunic felt heavier somehow, not with burden, but with the accumulated honor of all who had worn similar uniforms in defense of their country. Margaret had returned to her small village with a story she was eager to share, but initially found herself struggling to put the experience into words. How could she explain the profound impact of those few minutes at the palace gates? How could she convey the significance of a single tear on a guard's cheek, or the life-changing power of an unauthorized salute? Eventually, she began sharing Michael's story more openly, using her encounter with the Queen's Guard as a way to keep her grandson's memory alive. The local newspaper in Yorkshire caught wind of Margaret's story when she mentioned it during a church service dedicated to remembering fallen soldiers. A young journalist named Sarah Collins was moved by the tale and asked if she could write about Margaret's experience. The resulting article, titled "A Grandmother's Journey to Honor a Fallen Hero," captured the hearts of readers across the region and eventually gained national attention. James, meanwhile, faced no official consequences for his breach of protocol. His commanding officers, upon hearing whispered accounts of what had transpired, chose to view the incident as an example of military values transcending rigid regulations. The salute to honor a fallen comrade, even if technically improper, embodied the very spirit that the Queen's Guard was meant to represent. Instead of discipline, James found himself quietly commended for understanding that some moments require humanity to take precedence over ceremony. The story of Margaret and James began to spread. Through military communities across Britain, social media posts and word-of-mouth accounts transformed their brief encounter into something legendary. Veterans organizations shared the tale as an example of how the bonds between soldiers extend beyond time and circumstance. Active duty personnel found inspiration in James's willingness to risk his standing to honor a fallen comrade's memory. Margaret received letters from families across the country who had lost loved ones in military service. Many shared their own stories of grief and pride, finding comfort in knowing that there were young soldiers like James who understood the true cost of freedom. She responded to each letter personally, often including copies of Michael's photograph and sharing details about his life and service. 6 months after their first meeting, Margaret made another journey to London. This time she was not alone. She was accompanied by Sarah Collins, the journalist who had written about her story, and by representatives from several military charities who had been inspired by the tale of the grandmother and the guard. They came not just to witness the changing of the guard ceremony, but to present a special memorial plaque in Michael's honor. James was not on duty that day, but he had been invited to attend the ceremony in his dress uniform. When he saw Margaret approaching with her small entourage, his face broke into a genuine smile. The elderly woman looked healthier and more at peace than she had during their first encounter, as if sharing Michael's story had lifted some of the burden she had carried alone for so long. The plaque, made of polished brass and engraved with Michael's name, rank, and service details, would be placed in a memorial garden dedicated to fallen soldiers. During the brief ceremony, Margaret spoke about her grandson's dreams of serving as a Queen's Guard and how meeting James had helped her understand that Michael's spirit lived on in every soldier who wore the uniform with pride and dedication. James was asked to say a few words during the ceremony, and he chose them carefully. He spoke about the honor of serving in the Queen's Guard, about the weight of tradition and the responsibility that came with the uniform. But most importantly, he spoke about how meeting Margaret and learning Michael's story had changed his understanding of what it meant to serve. Every time he stood guard now, he carried with him the memory of all those who had made the ultimate sacrifice. The ceremony concluded with James once again saluting in Michael's honor, this time with official approval, and in front of a small crowd of supporters. Margaret watched with tears in her eyes, but they were tears of joy and pride rather than grief. Her grandson's memory had found a permanent home in the hearts of those who understood its significance. As the crowd dispersed, Margaret and James had a few moments to speak privately. She thanked him again for the kindness he had shown during their first meeting, and he thanked her for sharing Michael's story. They exchanged contact information, beginning a correspondence that would continue for years to come. Margaret had gained not just peace about her grandson's death, but also a new purpose in ensuring that the sacrifices of all fallen soldiers would be remembered and honored. Years later, Margaret would establish the Michael Thompson Memorial Fund, which provided support for military families dealing with loss. James would eventually rise through the ranks, becoming a sergeant major, who was known for his deep understanding of military tradition and his compassion for the human stories behind the uniforms. He would often tell new recruits about the day an elderly woman taught him that true military honor comes not from perfect adherence to protocol, but from understanding why the protocols exist in the first place. The photograph of Lance Corporal Michael Thompson, which had started this entire journey, found its way into a place of honor in the Regimental Museum. Below it, a small plaque told the story of the day his grandmother's love broke through the stoic facade of a Queen's Guard, creating a moment of human connection that would inspire countless others to remember that behind every uniform stands a person, and behind every fallen soldier stands a family whose love endures forever. Margaret continued to visit London annually until she was well into her 80s, always timing her trips to coincide with the changing of the guard ceremony. She would stand in the same spot where she had first shared Michael's story, watching the young soldiers perform their duties with pride and precision. Sometimes she would spot James among the guards, and they would exchange a subtle nod of recognition across the years of friendship their first meeting had created. The story of the Royal Guard who broke protocol to honor a fallen soldier became part of military folklore, passed down through generations of soldiers as an example of when humanity should triumph over regulation. It reminded everyone who heard it that the greatest honor a soldier can receive is not a medal or promotion, but the knowledge that their service and sacrifice will never be forgotten by those who understand its true meaning. Margaret Thompson passed away peacefully in her Yorkshire home at the age of 87, surrounded by family and friends whose lives had been touched by her dedication to preserving Michael's memory. At her funeral, representatives from military units across Britain came to pay their respects, including several members of the Queen's Guard. James, now a senior officer, delivered a eulogy that celebrated not just Margaret's life, but her unwavering love for a grandson whose story had touched so many hearts. The final legacy of that autumn day at Buckingham Palace was not the breach of protocol or the unauthorized salute, but the reminder that true military service is about more than following orders or maintaining traditions. It is about understanding that every uniform represents a human being with a story worth telling, a family worth protecting, and a sacrifice worth remembering. Margaret Thompson and her grandson Michael had given that reminder to James and through him to countless others, ensuring that the true meaning of service would continue to inspire future generations of soldiers who would stand guard over the values and freedoms they all held dear.